Berlin, 1945. The night air was thick with smoke and fear. Sirens screamed through the city, echoing off crumbling buildings and broken streets. Men, women, and children rushed for shelter, clutching what little they had left. The war had already brought fire to their skies before, but tonight, something felt different. At first, it sounded like distant thunder, a low hum that rolled across the horizon. But as German radar screens flickered to life, the operators froze. This was no storm. An unidentified aircraft had entered their airspace, faster, higher, and stranger than anything they had ever recorded. It was moving too steadily, too smoothly. And it was alone. Up in the clouds, pilots scrambled their fighters to intercept, their engines roaring against the night. But by the time they reached the altitude, the object had vanished, leaving nothing but silence and confusion. Ground control tried to make sense of it. Was it British, Soviet, a new Allied bomber? The Luftwaffe command couldn't tell. All they knew was that it shouldn't be possible. And then the light came. A sudden flash split the night sky, brighter than flak fire, sharper than lightning. A roar followed that shook windows across the city. Officers stared upward, realizing in horror that something entirely new had just entered the war. They didn't know it yet, but the balance of power had shifted. America had just unleashed a weapon that would change everything. In the early years of the war, Germany seemed unstoppable. Cities fell like dominoes beneath the relentless force of blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tanks rolled across Poland's fields, planes screamed over France, and in just weeks Europe was at Hitler's feet. The world watched in disbelief as the Third Reich stretched its iron grip from the North Sea to the borders of the Soviet Union. Every offensive felt surgical, precise, and merciless. To the German people it felt like destiny. To the Allies, it felt like defeat creeping closer each day. But by late 1944, the cracks had begun to show. The war that was once swift and clean had become slow and suffocating. The Allies had stormed the beaches of Normandy. Paris had been liberated, and the Red Army was pushing west, grinding the Wehrmacht back mile by mile. Yet even in retreat, Germany fought like a wounded predator, vicious, unpredictable, and unwilling to die. Then came Hitler's final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate counterattack through the snow-covered Ardennes. For a brief moment it worked. Allied troops were caught off guard, freezing, surrounded, outgunned. But the gamble was doomed. When the skies cleared, American air power turned the tide. Germany's tanks burned black in the snow. Thousands of soldiers never made it home. The Reich had broken its own spine, trying to stand tall one last time. Still, victory was far from guaranteed. Every step into Germany was a blood price. Allied bombers took to the skies day and night, hammering industrial targets, railways, and cities. But the Luftwaffe's defenses were ruthless. Anti-aircraft flak tore through Allied formations. Fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262, the first operational jet, made the skies lethal. Crews knew that every mission could be their last. The cost of breaking through was unbearable. American commanders needed something else, something beyond courage and firepower. They needed a weapon that could fly higher than flak, outrun any jet, and strike at the heart of the Reich without mercy or loss. In Washington and Los Alamos, that desperate need became an obsession. Scientists whispered about technologies that could end the war in a single blow, even as generals debated whether humanity was ready to wield such power. The Allies were closing in on Germany from all sides. But to finally crush the Nazi war machine, they would need more than strength. They would need a miracle. And somewhere in the deserts of America, that miracle was already being built. The war in Europe was tearing itself apart, cities reduced to rubble, nations split between ruin and resistance. But thousands of miles away, in the sun-bleached silence of the New Mexico desert, a different kind of battle was being fought, one of equations, ideas and secrecy. It was here, under the blistering heat and red dust, that some of the world's most brilliant minds gathered in places that didn't exist on any map. Behind barbed wire fences and guarded gates, American engineers, physicists, and military strategists worked under code names that meant nothing to the outside world. Project Manhattan, Project Silverplate, and the B-29 Super Fortress program. To the few who were allowed inside, it wasn't just research. It was destiny being written in the desert. The B-29 Super Fortress was unlike anything the skies had ever seen. A flying fortress that could soar above 30,000 feet, beyond the reach of most enemy guns. It could carry more weight, fly faster, and stay aloft longer than any bomber in history. With its pressurized cabins, remote-controlled turrets, and 4 massive engines, it was a technological leap so significant that even the men who built it didn't fully grasp what it would one day carry. The teams worked day and night under strict orders. General Leslie Groves, the man in charge of the Manhattan Project, made sure no one saw the full picture. Scientists at Los Alamos only knew part of what they were building. Engineers at Wendover Airfield tested bomb casings without knowing what would fill them. And the crews training to fly the B-29s were told only this: what you are doing will end the war. But even as secrecy blanketed the American desert, whispers began to drift across the Atlantic. In Berlin, the Abwehr, Germany's intelligence service, had intercepted fragments of encrypted Allied communications. Mentions of a super bomber, of something being tested in the western deserts. Analysts couldn't make sense of it. One report described a bomber so advanced it could fly beyond the reach of their radar. Another hinted at a new form of weapon, more devastating than 1,000 bombs. Some dismissed it as propaganda. Others, especially the scientists inside Hitler's own weapons division, were not so sure. Deep within Peenemünde, where Werner von Braun and his team developed the V-2 rockets, discussions turned uneasy. If America was building a bomber that could carry such a weapon, what kind of weapon could it be? Hitler's obsession with Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons, had pushed his scientists to the brink. Jet fighters, rocket missiles, even talk of nuclear energy. But now, for the first time, they feared someone else might already be ahead. Back in the desert, the nights were eerily quiet. The wind swept through empty hangars and tents as men scribbled formulas on blackboards under the dim light of kerosene lamps. Every calculation, every experiment brought them closer to something no one fully understood, something powerful enough to reshape the meaning of war itself. No one spoke about what would happen when it was finished. They just kept working, hour after hour, day after day. Occasionally, test pilots would return from missions, pale-faced and silent. They spoke of strange, glowing lights in the distance, of explosions that weren't like anything they'd seen before. One pilot whispered to another, "They're building something here, something that doesn't belong to this world." In Washington, reports flowed upward, coded, fragmented, urgent. The president was briefed in guarded language. A single line stood out: "If successful, this weapon will make invasion unnecessary." As the months dragged on, the desert began to hum, with engines, with energy, with tension. The line between science and sorcery seemed to blur. The men who once dreamed of discovery now worked in silence, haunted by the thought of what their invention might do once unleashed. And across the ocean, German scientists stared at intercepted fragments and satellite photos, tracing every rumor, every signal. They didn't know the name of the project. They didn't know where it was, but they knew one thing for certain. America was building something big, and it was coming for them. They were some of the greatest minds of their generation, men who had studied stars and atoms, who once believed their knowledge would serve peace and progress. Yet now, behind the sealed gates of Los Alamos, they worked under code names and curfews, their brilliance bent toward a single purpose: to build the deadliest weapon humanity had ever imagined. At the center of it all was J. Robert Oppenheimer, thin, intense, with hollow eyes that rarely blinked. To his colleagues, he was a genius, a poet in a world of numbers. To the military, he was the man who would deliver victory. Oppenheimer had once written about the beauty of physics, about understanding the secrets of the universe. But now, every calculation brought him closer to something that felt like damnation. He often walked the desert alone at night, cigarette glowing in the darkness, haunted by the knowledge that his discoveries might one day erase entire cities. Standing beside him, though they could not have been more different, was General Leslie Groves. A man of absolute control, Groves was the iron fist of the Manhattan Project. He had built the Pentagon, and now he was building something far more dangerous. To him, secrecy was survival. He didn't trust easily, not even the scientists whose names filled Nobel archives. Under his command, no one spoke out of turn, no one saw the full picture. Groves didn't need them to understand. He just needed them to deliver. The partnership between the general and the physicist was uneasy, almost combustible. Groves believed in military precision. Oppenheimer believed in the power of ideas. Yet both knew they were part of something that could end the war or end humanity. As Oppenheimer once told his team, the physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge they cannot lose. While the Americans labored under the desert sun, Germany's own scientists were racing toward their own vision of destruction. In underground labs and mountain fortresses, Werner von Braun and his engineers perfected the V-2 rocket, a weapon that could strike London from across the Channel without warning. Each rocket left a trail of fire and smoke, crashing down with the speed of sound and the silence of inevitability. Hitler called it his revenge weapon, his Wunderwaffe. To him, these rockets would restore Germany's pride. But to the men who built them, they were proof that the race for power had gone far beyond the front lines. Back in Los Alamos, the tension grew unbearable. Experiments failed. Equipment malfunctioned. Theoretical calculations collided with reality. Each mistake felt catastrophic. The scientists worked in shifts that blurred into days, surviving on black coffee and fear. They argued over formulas, over morality, over whether mankind should even possess what they were building. Yet the war pressed on, and with every telegram reporting Allied losses, the urgency deepened. Some found solace in the idea that their creation would save lives, that if they could end the war quickly, the killing would stop. Others stared at their blueprints and wondered what kind of peace could ever come from this. By early 1945, both sides were standing on the edge of revelation. The Germans had jet aircraft that could outpace any Allied fighter. The Americans had a weapon that no one fully understood, only feared. Neither side knew which breakthrough would come first, or what the world would look like after it did. In that frozen moment of history, the scientists and soldiers, the generals and engineers, were united by a single truth. Once the secret left the laboratory, there would be no turning back. The countdown had already begun, and humanity's future would soon be decided not on the battlefield, but in the glow of a weapon born from the minds of men who had dared to understand the atom. The morning of August 6, 1945, began like any other on the Pacific island of Tinian. Humid air, restless soldiers, and the endless hum of machinery. But among the lines of bombers gleaming under the rising sun, one stood apart. Its name, painted carefully on its nose, read, Enola Gay. Inside, a crew of 12 men prepared in silence. Each movement was rehearsed, each word measured. None of them fully knew what they were carrying, only that this mission was different. The bomb bay held a steel cylinder nearly 10 feet long, its surface cold, its core alive with something the world had never seen. Its codename was Little Boy. At 2:45 a.m., the Enola Gay began to roll down the runway. Engines roared, tires lifted from the ground, and the plane disappeared into the darkness, carrying within it the result of years of secrecy, sacrifice, and fear. The scientists at Los Alamos had done it. They had split the atom, and in doing so, had split history itself. But before this final moment, months earlier, Germany's high command had already sensed what was coming. In early 1945, as Berlin was bombarded night after night, fragments of Allied transmissions had reached the Abwehr, references to a final weapon, mass energy, and projects in the desert. The words didn't make sense, but the tone did. It was urgency. It was power. Rumors spread among German scientists that the Americans had cracked something even Heisenberg himself had failed to master. In one intercepted report, a Luftwaffe officer described a blinding explosion from an unknown test site and aircraft capable of surviving forces impossible for human flight. For months, they had dismissed these as myths, phantoms of propaganda meant to terrify them. But on August 6th, those myths became reality. As the Enola Gay approached Hiroshima, the crew stared through the clouds. Below, the city looked peaceful, unaware. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. A single metallic shape fell silently, tumbling toward the earth. 43 seconds later, the world changed, a flash brighter than the sun. A roar that swallowed all sound. A wave of fire that flattened everything in its path. Hiroshima ceased to exist in seconds. From 31,000 feet above, the crew of the Enola Gay could only stare, speechless. The cloud that rose beneath them wasn't smoke. It was a living thing, twisting and expanding into the shape of a monstrous mushroom that reached for the heavens. Beneath it, an entire city had vanished. Half a world away, when the first reports reached what remained of Germany's military and scientific circles, disbelief turned to horror. They read eyewitness accounts of shadows burned into stone, of streets turned to glass, of silence where thousands had once stood. This was what they had feared. This was the weapon the Reich could never build, the one that would have reduced Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg to ashes if the war in Europe had lasted just a few months longer. In the bunkers and laboratories that still operated under Allied watch, captured German scientists exchanged glances of dread. Werner von Braun, hearing the first details, said quietly, "We were too late. For the Americans, the message was clear. The weapon had worked. The unimaginable was now possible. And while Germany's surrender had spared it from such destruction, the demonstration left no doubt. This was not just a weapon of victory. It was a weapon of warning. In Washington, President Truman announced to the world that the United States had harnessed the basic power of the universe. But even he could not grasp the full weight of what had been unleashed. Across the oceans, leaders watched in silence, realizing that warfare had crossed a line it could never retreat from. Back in the desert, Oppenheimer stood in the heat of Los Alamos, the news echoing through the labs. There were no cheers, no celebration, only silence. He thought of the moment he had watched the first test explosion in July, the sand turning to glass, the air trembling with power. Then he had whispered the words that would haunt him forever. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And as the mushroom cloud rose over Hiroshima, those words became prophecy. The secret weapon America had unleashed did more than end a war. It ended an era. The age of conventional battle was over. The skies, once filled with fire and bullets, were now ruled by something invisible, unstoppable, and absolute. The world would never be the same again. Across the ruins of a broken Reich, word began to spread, not through official reports, but through whispers that carried farther than any broadcast. America had done it. They had created a weapon that could erase a city in seconds. At first, no one believed it, but the evidence was undeniable. Hiroshima was gone. In the bombed-out remains of Berlin, surviving officers and scientists sat in silence, reading the fragmented reports smuggled through Allied channels. Some thought it was a trick, a psychological operation meant to break the last threads of German resistance. But for the few who understood physics, men like Werner Heisenberg and Werner von Braun, the truth struck like thunder. The Allies had not only won the war, they had conquered the atom. In laboratories once funded by the Reich, chalkboards still bore half-erased equations, fragments of failed dreams. Heisenberg's team had come close, but never close enough. They had built a reactor, yes, but not the chain reaction, not the power. When they read about the bomb dropped from a B-29, they realized what had escaped them. Not a lack of intelligence, but a lack of time, and perhaps mercy. For Hitler's scientists, the race had always been one of pride, a belief that German innovation was unmatched, that no other nation could rival their science. But now that illusion was ash in the wind. The so-called Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapons Hitler had promised, the V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, the super tanks, suddenly seemed primitive, toys from an earlier age. The real wonder weapon belonged to someone else. Werner von Braun, hiding in the Bavarian Alps with his remaining engineers, understood instantly what the atomic revelation meant. "It's over," he said quietly to his brother. "The war of machines has ended. Now begins the war of the mind." He knew that his work and his survival depended on surrendering to the right hands. Within weeks, he and his team would seek out American forces, offering their knowledge in exchange for safety. It was not loyalty to the Reich that drove them anymore, but the knowledge that Germany's empire of science was finished. Meanwhile, among what was left of the Nazi leadership, despair turned to denial. Some refused to believe the Americans had achieved what even the greatest German physicists could not. They called it impossible, unscientific, even divine. "No man commands the power of the sun," one general reportedly said. But the photographs said otherwise. Cities reduced to vapor, skies turned white with light, entire populations gone in the blink of an eye, and beneath that realization was something deeper, a shattering of faith in their own myth. For years, the Nazi propaganda machine had preached the superiority of German intellect, German strength, German destiny. But the truth could no longer be hidden. The nation that had boasted of creating a 1,000-year Reich had been outmatched in less than a decade by a country half a world away. Among the rubble, scientists who once dreamed of building the future now faced interrogation and exile. Some were captured, others defected, their talents absorbed by their former enemies in what would later be called Operation Paperclip. But behind every negotiation, every quiet surrender lay the same realization. Germany had lost more than a war. It had lost its identity as the pinnacle of progress. As Allied soldiers marched through the last streets of the Reich, they saw what was left of a civilization that had bet everything on science and domination. Laboratories burned, machines rusted, dreams collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. The men who once believed they could reshape the world now stared at the dawn of a new one, a world where America held the key to annihilation. In that moment, the German war machine didn't just surrender its armies, it surrendered its soul. The age of conquest had ended, and the age of fear had begun. The war was over, but peace did not feel like victory. Across the world, cities still smoldered, skies still echoed with silence, and the shadows of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stretched longer than any empire ever had. The atomic bomb had ended World War II, but in its blinding light, a new darkness began to form. The men who had built it, Oppenheimer, Groves, Fermi, and hundreds of others, should have been celebrated as heroes. Instead, they stood in uneasy triumph, realizing they had given humanity not salvation, but choice. They had proven what science could do, but also what it could destroy. The desert, where they first saw the flash of their creation, was silent again, but in their minds, the echo of that explosion never stopped. When Oppenheimer was asked what went through his mind at that first test, he didn't speak of victory or pride. He spoke of Scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Those words were not celebration, they were confession. But the world did not slow down to reflect. Even as the last German officers signed their surrender and Japan lay in ruins, a new rivalry began to take shape. The Soviet Union, America's uneasy ally, watched with suspicion and fear. Stalin's spies had already reported what the Americans had done in the desert. Within months, Soviet scientists were gathering in their own secret facilities, racing to replicate the unimaginable. The Cold War had begun, not with soldiers or tanks, but with scientists and secrets. Laboratories replaced battlefields, and calculations replaced gunfire. America's secret weapon had not ended the fight for power. It had changed its form. The world was now balanced on a knife's edge, where one miscalculation could erase nations. For the people of Germany, the revelation of the bomb was both relief and terror. The war that had destroyed them might have ended in fire had it lasted longer. The weapon that annihilated Japan could have easily fallen upon Berlin, Munich, or Dresden. The German scientists who once believed in their own supremacy now found themselves working for the very powers they had once sworn to defeat, America and the Soviet Union, helping them build even deadlier machines in a new, silent war. Back in Los Alamos, the mood was somber. The fences still stood, the guards still patrolled, but the sense of purpose had changed. The project that had united thousands under a single cause had become a symbol of everything they feared most. Some scientists left, unable to live with the guilt. Others stayed, warning of a world that could destroy itself in pursuit of security. General Groves, ever the pragmatist, saw the bomb as a tool of deterrence. "No one will dare attack us now," he said. But Oppenheimer knew better. He knew that once knowledge existed, it could not be contained. If America could build it, so could others. And when others did, the world would live forever under the shadow of its own genius. In the years that followed, the world changed rapidly. Alliances fractured, walls were built, and nuclear tests painted the sky with fire once more. Children learned to hide under desks, governments stockpiled missiles, and the fear of total annihilation became part of daily life. The scientists had given mankind the power of gods, but not the wisdom to wield it. The same intellect that had once shocked Germany now terrified every nation on Earth. The race for survival had become a race of who could destroy faster, farther, louder. As the story of the war closed, the final image lingers, not the triumph of victory, but the tremor of realization. Humanity had crossed a line it could never uncross. The cities that once burned in war were now only a whisper away from disappearing in peace. And in that uneasy silence, Oppenheimer's words echoed again, a reminder, a warning, and perhaps a prophecy. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The weapon that ended one war had already begun the next.